Alright guys, welcome back. This is going to be 2.2 video notes for this unit. And we're continuing this idea of trying to think differently about math and trying to think about more logic and reasoning about different things. So today you're going to see a little bit of a shift. We spent last lesson going over a little bit more of the basic ideas behind logic and reasoning, but we still had a good amount of math involved. These ones, it's going to be a little bit different. We're more along the lines of statements and being able to kind of figure out what is a conditional statement, how do I rewrite this in a different way, so on and so forth. So the good news is that if you are getting bogged down by the math a little bit or doing the algebra or setting up equations, this is going to be kind of a shift. Bad news is if you enjoyed those things, this is a different way of thinking. And we're kind of shifting that a little bit. And the reason we're doing that is, like I said earlier, is because we're going through proofs, and proofs don't just go through step by step with showing how to get from x 2x plus 10 equals 15 to the next step. Now it's, can I explain how I can go from one step to the other? Okay, so keep that in mind. Label for today is going to be 2.2 conditional statements. Date for today is going to be the 2nd of October. And then objective, we want to be able to identify the hypothesis and conclusion of a conditional statement. And we'll talk about what all those words mean. And then you also want to be able to write what we call the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive of a statement as well. And like I said, we'll kind of talk about those and dive into those here a little later. Okay, so first piece here, a conditional statement. Move myself up a little bit. Okay, a conditional statement is just, I'll get this out here, a statement. A general statement could be about math, could not be about math. A statement, I'm going to move for a sec, that can be written in the if-then form. Okay, a statement that can be written in the if-then form. So if something, then something else. So for example here, you could come up with legitimately millions of these kinds of examples of if-then statements. But for instance, for one, we could say, if I eat healthy, then I will feel better. Okay? If I eat healthy, then I will feel better. This would be an example of a conditional statement. And notice some of you might agree or disagree with this statement, but that's the basic idea. Okay? So that's the first piece. With the hypothesis and the conclusion, hopefully you've kind of seen these words either in English class before or possibly with science, if we're talking about scientific method and have a hypothesis that you're trying to test. Okay, but the hypothesis in this case, when we're talking about conditional statements, is just the phrase hypothesis, specifically the hypothesis of a conditional. This is not just the definition of a hypothesis, is the phrase that immediately follows the if. The phrase that immediately follows the if. Okay, so for instance, in this case, or the example we just used, my hypothesis was, or my statement was, if I eat healthy, then I will feel better. My hypothesis is just, I eat healthy. Okay, that's the kind of conditional part of that if. If then this happens. So notice the if is not included. I would just say that I eat healthy part is my hypothesis. Okay, and I can even write that down here as well. For an example, if we're continuing, I eat healthy. Okay, and then the conclusion is the reverse side of that. So the conclusion is the phrase that immediately follows the then. Conclusion is the phrase that immediately follows the then. So in this example that we were using, notice again, I'm not including then when I write this out, and you'll have problems on your homework where you need to make sure you're not including if and not including then. But in this case, it would be, I will feel better would be my conclusion. That is the conclusion that I've come to. Okay, we kind of talked about conclusions a little bit in last lesson with inductive reasoning. You have all these tiny little details that helping you come to a conclusion. In this case, this is our last piece. Okay, so getting into examples with this, like I said, we're not going to be doing as much math. It's more just being able to read statements and identify the different pieces of that. So I'll give you a sec to write this down. I'm given this conditional statement. I want to identify the hypothesis, identify the conclusion, and then last pieces of I want to say if the statement is true or not. Okay, so I say if the forecast calls for rain, then I will take an umbrella to school. If the forecast calls for rain, then I will take an umbrella to school. Okay, so first piece here, hopefully you have this written down. If not, you can pause real quick. I want to identify the hypothesis. Identify the hypothesis. Again, like we said, we're not including the if, we're just including everything after it up to then. So we're going to say the hypothesis is the forecast calls for rain. That is my hypothesis. That is the conditional part of the statement. Given this, or if this, if the forecast calls for rain. And then the conclusion, last piece here, okay, we know that's just the part after then. I will take an umbrella I will take an umbrella to school. Okay, that's our conclusion. Again, I'm not including then. I'll say I will take an umbrella to school. Okay, basic piece. Hopefully we're able to kind of figure these out very simply. Here's the part right after if, there's my hypothesis, here's the part right after then. The reason this is so important and the reason we're going through the basics of it is because it's going to get a little more complicated later in this lesson. So we want to make sure we can identify the hypothesis and conclusion very quickly. Okay, and the last piece here, it says determine if the statements are true, or I should really say determine if the statement is true. Okay, in this case, if I'm looking here, if the forecast calls for rain, I will take my umbrella to school. This could actually be true or false depending on what you're doing. Let's say for this one, since we're in online learning right now, we're going to say false. Okay, if the forecast calls for rain, I don't really need to care because I'm staying in my house the whole time, right? So in that case, we'll say this statement would be false. And then even if we were coming to school, how many of you would bring an umbrella to school? That's up in the air, okay? But that's the basic idea. All right, so that is the first piece. Example 2. I'm given this statement and I want to write it as a conditional. So sometimes you're not always going to be given a statement in the form of if, then, but we want to be able to convert it to that. Because people don't usually talk like that in everyday life, right? They're not saying, what are you doing this weekend? Well, I'm going to the store. As long as it doesn't rain or something. I wouldn't say if I go to the store, or if it rains, then I will not go to the store, or something along those lines. We don't talk like that, right? So we're going to try to convert it here. The sum of two supplementary angles is 180 degrees. The sum of two supplementary angles is 180 degrees. Okay, so I want to write this in if-then form. So I'm going to write conditional here. So first piece, I need to say if. And this is not always a process of just throwing if and then in the middle of my statement and saying, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, make sure that you are thinking through how you would actually phrase this. So what is the hypothesis? What is the conditional that we're saying here? If I have two supplementary angles is my piece here. Okay, so if two angles are supplementary, okay, like we said, people don't always talk in the form of if-then, so we need to be able to convert this statement into that kind of form, and that means rearranging the words a little bit so that it makes sense. Okay, if two angles are supplementary, then what is the conclusion that I'm coming to? Well, I'm saying the sum of them is 180 degrees. So I'm going to say then their sum, or what I get when I add them up, is 180 degrees. Okay, and that would be all I need to do for that one. So you'll have some of those on your homework as well, or on future assignments. Okay, and like I said, the basic idea with this is you're not always just throwing if at the beginning and then dead in the middle and saying, okay, here's a statement that makes sense. Sometimes you have to rearrange the words a little bit to make sure that it makes a coherent statement. If two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180, and hopefully we understand that that is true because we just studied that in the last chapter. Okay, so moving on to the next one here. Well, this is 3.2, that should be 2.2. Okay. Next part here, we need to talk about different ways to write these because there's a conditional statement and then I have what we call the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. So first definition here, the converse of a phrase is formed by switching the hypothesis. Try to write that again. Formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, it's formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if we wanted to go back to our first example here, and I want to see what that looks like, and we'll practice this a little bit more. Instead of saying, if I eat healthy, then I will feel better, what we're doing is we're taking these two pieces and we're swapping their places. Okay? And in this case, it would say, if I feel better, or if I will feel better, then I will eat healthy. Something along those lines. Okay? That's the idea with the converse. And like I said, we'll write another example of that here in a minute. Okay? Next one here, the inverse. The inverse is formed by, we're not going to switch anything. Our hypothesis and conclusion are going to stay in the same place. We're going to do this thing called negating, which is basically saying the opposite of something. So formed by negating the hypothesis and conclusion. Okay, formed by negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. So again, if we just keep using the same example, if I eat healthy, then I will feel better. So then I would want to say the opposite of both of those. So I would say, if I don't eat healthy, then I will not feel better. That would be what we call the inverse. Okay? So I have the converse, I have the inverse, and now this big word, what we call the contrapositive, is we do both of these together. So contrapositive is formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion So contrapositive is what we call, so same part as the converse to start, formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion, and negating both of them. So this is the combination of the two. I'm switching their places, and then I'm also saying the opposite of both of them. So our original statement was, if I eat healthy, then I will feel better. Okay, the contrapositive, doing all of that, will be, if I don't feel better, then I will not eat healthy. So I'm switching them and negating them at the same time. Okay, so we're going to make this table, because this is a little bit more confusing. We're going to make this table to make sure we have a place where we can see, here's what the conditional is, here's what the converse is, so on and so forth, and have an example for each. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause your video real quick, and I want you to make this table. Okay, it's going to be a 4x3 table, and I'm actually going to need to move myself here in a minute. Okay, but it's going to be a 4x3 table, and we're going to include all these different pieces here. We just lost my video. All right, so pause your video, draw this, and then we'll come back together. Okay, so hopefully you have this drawn. Hopefully you have the rows and the columns. And here's what we're going to do. In the first column, we're just going to write the names of all of our kinds of statements. Okay, so first one we talked about was conditional. Next one we talked about was converse. After that we have inverse. And then finally our contrapositive. Okay, And here's how we're going to kind of define this a little bit, or a different way of thinking of it. Instead of saying, here's what I do with the hypothesis, here's what I do with the conclusion, I'm just going to give a letter to each of these, to the hypothesis and the conclusion, just to try to simplify it a little bit. So I'm going to say P is going to represent the hypothesis. P is going to represent the hypothesis, and then Q is going to represent the conclusion. Okay, as you can tell, or as you can imagine, I did not choose these letters. I would choose different letters, but I believe these come from the Latin words for hypothesis and conclusion. This is what mathematicians did when they were kind of coming up with this. Okay, so a way to think about this with the actual statements is if I'm looking at a conditional, this means if P, then I'm going to draw this arrow to represent then Q. If I have P, then I have Q. It's just a cause and effect. Okay? Now with this idea in mind, or if I phrase it this way, then I can kind of shift these around for converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So the converse is switch, right? So I would say if Q, if the conclusion first, the conclusion of the original statement, then P, the hypothesis of the original statement. Okay? The inverse, P and Q stay in the same place, but we negate them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add this little symbol for what is used for negating, which is kind of like the little squiggly line that goes above the congruent symbol. But I'm saying if I negate P, or if I say the opposite of P, then I say the opposite of Q. Okay, that is what the inverse does. Okay? And then the last piece here, like we said, is it does the converse and inverse both together. So it switches the place of them. So I say, if I say the opposite of Q, if I say the opposite of the original conclusion, then I have the opposite of the original hypothesis. Okay? So that is the idea here. And then last piece is if I were to write a statement out for each. So let's say if, let's use a geometry example. If measure of angle 1 equals 35 degrees, then it is acute. Okay, this is just an example to see each one. So let's start with our original statement. We have if the measure of angle 1 equals 35 degrees, then it is acute. So we have our hypothesis, angle equals 35, and our conclusion, it's acute. Okay, converse switches that. So we can say if the angle, and notice how I have to change the wording a little bit, but if an angle, I won't say the angle, but an angle is acute. If an angle is acute, then measure of angle 1 equals 35 degrees, or the measure of that angle would equal 35. Okay? And notice that's actually a false statement. Just because an angle is acute doesn't mean it has to be 35, right? Okay, but that's the idea. Okay? Next one, inverse here. If the measure of angle 1, I want to say the opposite of it, right? So if the measure of angle 1 is not 35 degrees, then it is not acute. Okay, that is the basic idea with negating, is I'm basically throwing the word not in there. If measure of angle 1 is not 35 degrees, then it is not acute. And again, notice that's actually a false statement. I'll mark these here, true, false, and false, because I could have an angle that's not 35 degrees, but that doesn't mean it's not acute. I could come up with what we talked about last time, which is a counter example. So for instance, 45 degrees. That's not 35, but it is acute. Okay? And then last one here, mix them all up. So we're saying if measure of angle 1, or let's say angle 1 is not acute, then its measure does not equal 35 degrees. So again, I'm saying the opposite and switching them on one here. If angle 1 is not acute, then the measure of it cannot equal or does not equal 35 degrees. And notice that is a true statement. There's no way for me to create a 35 degree angle without it being acute. So if I say angle is not acute, then that marks off every one 0 through 90. Okay? All right, so that is the table. Hopefully that helps a little bit. And one thing you'll start to notice as well that I want to throw in here, because we're going to have a lot of questions where we're trying to figure out, is this true or is this false? This will be true for every case. The conditional and the contrapositive are always going to have the same, what we call truth value, or in other words, they're both going to be the same. Either they're both true or they're both false. Same thing here with the converse and inverse. They'll always be the same. Okay, either they're both going to be true or both going to be false. Okay, all of these could be true, all of these could be false, all at the same time. But notice the middle two are always going to be the same thing, either true or false, and then same thing with the outside two. Okay, last piece here, practicing all this. I have example 3, and I want to write 4 things. I want to write the conditional, the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive, kind of like we just did. Okay, and we're going to practice this a little bit more because we're going to be doing this on the assignment. Okay, and we'll do this on future assignments, quizzes, tests, so on and so forth. So I want you to write down the statement for me. A square has 4 sides. Square has 4 sides. And what we're going to do is we're going to practice writing all of these here. So first part is I need my conditional statement. I need to set this up so I know what is my hypothesis going to be, what is my conclusion going to be. So if, let's say we were talking about a square, the square is that first conditional piece. That's what I need. So I'm going to say if a shape is a square, if a shape is a square, then what is the conclusion that we come to? Well, it says it has 4 sides. Then it has 4 sides. Okay, like I said, I'm not just throwing if and then into the middle of these statements. I have to rephrase this a little bit. If a shape is a square, then it has 4 sides. Okay, next piece here, converse. I can do one of 2 things if I'm trying to figure out how to write the converse of a statement. Either I can go to the definition that we wrote earlier and say, okay, it's formed by switching the hypothesis and conclusion, or I can go to my table here and say, here's the conclusion, here's the, or original conclusion, I should say, here's the original hypothesis. Okay, whatever makes more sense to you. But in any case, the converse is I just switch those 2. So now I'm going to say if a shape has 4 sides, if a shape has 4 sides, then it is a square. Converse of that statement would be if a shape has 4 sides, then it is a square. Okay, in this case, it's asking, it doesn't ask whether it's actually true or false, but we can look at it and we can see that second one is actually false. Okay, just because a shape has 4 sides doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a square, right? Okay, so moving on here, inverse, practicing some more. Okay, inverse, remember, I'm keeping the hypothesis and conclusion in the same place. I'm just negating them. So I'm just saying the opposite. So let's say if a shape is not a square, okay, if a shape is not a square, then it does not, so I'll say does not have 4 sides. If a shape is not a square, then it does not have 4 sides. Okay, and again, I can see that is also false. I could come up with counterexamples or ways to disprove that statement. A rectangle, for instance, would be one that does have 4 sides, but is not it is not a square, but it does have 4 sides. Okay, and then last piece here, the contrapositive. And then we'll be done for the day. Let's combine them now. So I say if a shape does not have 4 sides, then, now what was my original hypothesis and how do I negate that? Then it is not a square. Okay, so this is the basic idea with these kinds of problems. It's just going to be a lot of writing and a lot of determining, is this true or is this false? Okay, so I have my conditional, converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Rest of time today, you have to work on that assignment. Okay, and I'll kind of clarify that in the Zoom call if that is not the case. But this is what you want to practice, and this is what you want to go back to. Okay, if you have any questions, as always, feel free to leave those in the Zoom call. Thanks, guys.